Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. How should we respond when the culture becomes inhospitable, if not actively hostile to Christian values? Sadly, biblical and natural law points of view on issues ranging from the sanctity of human life in the womb, to the protection of children from gender ideologies, to the defense of natural marriage, to the rejection of both IVF and euthanasia, to religious freedom itself, are now not welcome in many of the institutions that constitute the economic, social, and cultural core of our society, including corporations, public schools, higher education, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the legacy media, and even government entities themselves. What can Christians do to resist being excluded from, and sometimes actively persecuted by, these secular powerhouses? Does being a follower of Christ require us to remain passive and rely exclusively on prayer to hope for a better future? If, on the other hand, pushback against bigotry against Christianity can in fact be morally justified, if not morally obligatory, what forms of resistance are acceptable? What, from a strategic point of view, will help Christians maintain our rightful place within a pluralistic society? And how can we understand what it means to resist those who undermine Christians in light of Christ's command to love our enemies? Here to help us think through these and related questions is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, Bishop, welcome back to the studio. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, Matt. Always good to be with you.
So before we get into today's topic, which is on how to resist anti-Christian bigotry, I hear that you found some time recently to see a movie.
Oh, yeah. I saw Matt Walsh's movie, Am I a Racist? And I thought it was very funny. And I'll tell you, I won't give away too much, but something I liked about that movie is, I've been an outspoken opponent of wokeism for a long time, and he goes after the sort of DEI establishment for the grifting that it does, which is undoubtedly true. But what really struck me was, here's a group of people who are emphasizing an ideology that locks white people into a permanent state of guilt and people of color into a permanent state of victimization with no real way forward. It's a naming of this problem, but in such a way that it provides no constructive way out. So I thought these were people that are, certainly deserving of some skewering. So I appreciated that in the movie.
Well, as we're recording this, the movie made it to number 5 in the whole country.
Is that right?
Which is really significant.
For a movie like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So turning to today's topic, Bishop, you recently wrote an article in Newsweek on how Christians should actively resist those who are seeking to undermine Christianity. And we'll turn to that article in just a moment, some of your arguments. But first, as we usually do, let's get some definitions down on the table. So first, Bishop, what does it mean to say that an individual or culture is bigoted against Christianity or Christians? For example, how do we distinguish between skepticism of or even disagreement with Christianity and bigotry itself?
Yeah, I suppose you could say bigotry is some kind of persistent and irrational prejudice against a person or an institution. And that's always a bad thing. Whereas you suggest correctly, I think, have legitimate questions or concerns about an ideology or a religion, fine. And to bring that out into the public square for conversation, I have zero problem with that. My hero, Thomas Aquinas, did that all the time. He engaged that kind of question. But bigotry is a different thing. That's when you're dealing with this really irrational prejudice. And I think, sadly, a bit of anti-religious bigotry is on the rise in our country.
So connected to that, what would you say marks the line between a culture that is inhospitable to Christians and Christianity and one that is sort of crossed the line and is actively persecuting Christians?
Yeah, I go back here to Cardinal George, my mentor. That elements of our culture are inhospitable to Christianity, I think, is undeniable. In fact, a lot of the high culture, the more elite culture, is at least that, inhospitable to it. Is there a line that's crossed into sort of active persecution? And I think yes is the obvious answer to that. Is that happening here? In some of the legal moves that are being made or at least proposed, I would say yes. Moving from, mere inhospitability to attack, and if the law is being used as a means of aggression against Christian believers, that we can't hold our beliefs in a public forum, that they're being challenged legally, I think a certain line there has been crossed. Now, you want to keep going on the spectrum, you go to active persecution, which we've certainly witnessed up and down the centuries, and indeed in the present day in all different parts of the world. In our country, though, I think you're right. We're maybe in some parts of the culture on that line between the inhospitable and the, a more direct attack.
What about the economic consequences? There's many reports. I know some people individually, for example, who have been fired or at least not promoted in their places of work for holding really sort of generic mainstream Christian beliefs. So is that something that you've been made aware of as well?
Yeah, and that's the religious liberty question, which, I'm on the committee of the bishops for religious liberty, and we entertain those questions all the time and remark how they're being played out in the public sphere. It was Richard John Newhouse a long time ago, maybe 25 years ago, who said, someday articulating basic Christian moral convictions in the public arena will be seen as hate speech. And when he said that 25 or so years ago, the general reaction was, oh, come on, that's so exaggerated. No, that's never going to happen. Well, of course, that is happening.
That is happening.
In many ways. So that's a concern, obviously. Now, how do we engage that? That's the wider question.
Before we move to your argument, let's just expand the context just a little bit, Bishop. Help us understand anti-Christian bigotry in a historical context. Have we ever, as a church, lived in a time or place where we haven't had to deal with some form of hostility?
Right. I wasn't sure which direction your question was going, but once it went that way, I think, no, it's hard to name a time when there wasn't some kind of opposition to Christianity. Look, from the very beginning, look in the pages of the Acts of the Apostles, you can see it. And the reason is Christianity is a public religion. It's never been a matter of simply our private convictions. It's not just like a hobby or a private conviction. When you say Jesus Christ is Lord, which is the basic evangelical proclamation, that's a public remark. You're saying not Caesar, but Jesus is Lord. That's to say Jesus is the one to whom your final allegiance is due. Jesus is the Lord of your life in all aspects thereof. You can't avoid that being a public assertion. Well, that means it will be resisted in the public sphere. Look at when Paul preaches, we hear in the Acts of the Apostles, there were often riots that broke out. Paul was imprisoned, eventually killed. Almost all the first great apostles and proclaimers of the faith were killed. It's because Rome understood exactly the implications of their preaching. They knew it was a subversive message. Now, move past the apostolic age into the first centuries, and you find, not at every moment, but you see waves of persecution in those first centuries. And then, you want to bring it up to date? The century with by far the most Christian martyrs was the 20th century. Right. And we never think about that. We think, way back when there were martyrs. No. 20th century, by far was the century of Christian martyrdom. Does it continue in the 21st century? Yes, absolutely. So to your question, I don't know if there's ever been a time when we haven't met with some public opposition, sometimes brutal.
But it can be better or worse, right?
Yeah, as I say, in the early days, it went kind of in waves. And it depends on the culture. Sometimes the culture is more agreeable to Christianity. So maybe in the High Middle Ages, when the culture and the church were in much greater alignment, okay, those happen, those moments. Other moments when they fall out of harmony. And then sometimes, again, Cardinal George, they become so antipathetic to each other that we have martyrs. So that's the spectrum that the church is always on.
Let's now turn to your Newsweek article. So you originally wrote it in response to the gross mockery of Christ in the Last Supper that took place in the opening ceremony to the 2024 Olympics in Paris. But your argument really is responding to a general resurgence of anti-Christian prejudice in the West. So let me read one of the key passages in the article and then ask you to expand on it. You write, Catholics affirm the existence of God, which means we think there is a transcendent purpose to human life. We affirm a stable human nature, which means we don't think sex is a social construct. And we hold to objective moral values, which means we don't think living the good life is simply a matter of personal choice. Mm-hmm. Critics of Christianity know this, and that's why they deride us. They're telling us very clearly who they are and whom they're against, and we should believe them. So, Bishop, say a little more about why you emphasize there at the end, we should believe them. It's a kind of a harrowing quality to those words. Why did you choose them?
Well, that there really is a conflict at a fundamental philosophical level. This is not a superficial conflict, but a conflict of worldviews. What you find very often on the stage today in the West is what I've called the culture of self-invention. For that to hold sway, well, God has to be marginalized because God is the source of transcendent value. Objective moral values have to be set aside because if they're really objective, they condition my will. I don't invent them. Religion is the great proponent of these things, which stand athwart the self-invention culture. And they, when I say they, I mean, like, say, the leaders of the secular culture, they understand that. They know that many institutions that oppose them have fallen, but the church, in the measure that is true to itself, it is still their great opponent. And so on a regular basis, they have to kind of call us out. They have to mock us. They have to belittle us. They have to try through law to marginalize us. So when I say we should believe them, they're announcing through these actions and words that they know we stand athwart them. Believe them. They have correctly intuited that we're the most significant opponent. Okay, the church, as we say, has long been involved in these cultural struggles. This is a version of it today.
And given what they say and how they act, these leaders of secular culture, or against the church, what do you think their ultimate goal is with this mockery and this marginalization?
It's to eliminate the church. I mean, that is the ultimate goal. First, to kind of marginalize us, privatize us. That's been a strategy for a long time, is to say, sometimes, cloaking themselves in the pious language of the Western democracies, like, well, we, of course, acknowledge religious liberty, but that means you can whisper your convictions among yourselves. So it's a marginalized, privatized version of Christianity. But I would say the ultimate goal, of the avatars of the self-invention culture is to usher us off the stage. And you know this well, man, as a historian of philosophy, this is an old conviction. Right. It goes back, at least the beginning of the Enlightenment, where there was this kind of secularist assumption that religion will kind of naturally fade away. You see it in Rousseau, and you see it in Marx, certainly, and many other figures that, we'll kind of slough off the skin of religion as we move forward in our progress. Well, that still haunts the minds of a lot of people today. Religion will just fade away. Of course, the great counter claim is, look, it hasn't happened, has it? They've been saying this for hundreds of years now. Nietzsche, The Death of God, Sartre, and just line them up, Freud, all confidently predicting the end of religion, and we haven't gone away. So, in a way, I'm not so much concerned about that. That's an old hang-up of the secularist establishment, but it's proving itself false all the time.
So the article ends by highlighting the surge of faithful zeal at this past summer's National Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis, and you conclude writing, religious faith remains strong despite its detractors. In varied and sundry ways, they are trying to mock and bully us into irrelevance. I say to my fellow Christians, speak up, resist, and get in their way. So, Bishop, let's spend the rest of the conversation expanding on the meaning and significance of your words there. Speak up, resist, and get in their way. So I'll turn to some relevant biblical passages in a moment. First, Bishop, why do you think the 2024 Olympics represented a kind of watershed moment for you? A line that line in the sand that triggered a broad response to Christians that originally prompted you writing this article?
Well, it's interesting, because I didn't know about it. I was out for dinner. It was a Friday night, and Father Steve, who's the CEO of Word on Fire, he and I were out for dinner, and he said, "Did you see what happened at the Olympics today?" And I said, "No, I didn't hear about it." So he showed me the video of the mockery of the Last Supper, and it just kind of infuriated me. So I went home and just did that kind of spontaneous, off the top of my head response. And then it got this enormous, I think it was 6 or 7 million people, saw it. So I didn't that moment think, okay, this is a watershed. But after I did that and I saw the reaction to it, and then, not because of my little video, but there was this worldwide outpouring, I thought, yeah, maybe a line has been crossed. And it might have been, the importance of the Olympics in a city like Paris, this international stage where this mockery of Christianity was taking place. It was a prime example, let's say, of this general problem. But the reaction to my little video, I think, is telling. Obviously, I had critics and people that didn't like what I said, but I'd say overwhelmingly, people responded positively to it. And what I heard most often was, thank you for speaking up. And I'm glad finally somebody spoke out against this stuff, 'Cause I do think there has been a certain dereliction on the part of church leadership, that we haven't spoken out when we can and should when the church is being mocked.
So, what should we say up front to critics who say that calling for resistance in the way that you do in response to mockery is hyperbolic and disproportionate, and that it's just sort of a self-congratulatory, self-serving victimhood?
I don't think so. Gandhi is a long been a hero of mine. And go back to that famous film about Gandhi, now 40 years ago, hard to believe. In the film, someone comes up to Gandhi and says, I understand you believe in passive resistance. And Gandhi said, I don't believe in passive anything. And it's a very telling thing, because Gandhi did not believe in passivity in the presence of evil.
Right.
On the contrary, what he proposed was a very active, very provocative getting in the way of evil. Now, to do so nonviolently, indeed. And that was a revolutionary idea. Where did he learn it? He learned it from Matthew 5, 6, and 7, which young Mohandas Gandhi read when he came to London as a law student, as a very young man, didn't know the Christian Bible at all, read it, and he found it breathtaking, the Sermon on the Mount. But it's not passivity in the presence of evil. Gandhi saw, and King followed him. Martin Luther King, who would have been raised on these texts as a Christian. But Gandhi, I think, helped him to see Jesus is not advocating passivity in the presence of evil. No, it's a very provocative way to interrupt evil, but in such a way as to draw the evil person back into communion with you. It's not to play with the weapons of the world and just deal with your enemies aggressively. It's to draw them back into the beautiful community, precisely by a kind of shaming, a sort of mirroring back to the evil person what he's doing. But Gandhi, King, and I would say too, another great hero of mine, John Paul II. Watch him in Poland in 1979. Didn't have one weapon on him, used no weapon of the world whatsoever, but in front of 1 million people, used language and used ideas and used the provocative doctrines of Christianity to challenge, to get in the face of an oppressive system. And it so stirred the people that they chanted, "We want God," for 15 minutes in the presence of the communist government. Well, when that was happening, we probably didn't quite get it, but you look in retrospect, that was a revolution. Was he passive in the face of communism? I mean, give me a break. John Paul II, it was a provocative act of nonviolence that was meant to call out and get in the way of evil. So that's what Christians are called to do. And we could maybe do another show on this, but when you unpack that language from Matthew, from the Sermon on the Mount, you see this is not passivity. It's a very, very creative engagement of evil. And so that's what Christians are called upon to do.
Let's dig into that in more detail at the scriptural level as well.
Yeah,
this distinction that resistance does not mean passivity, but it also doesn't mean violence.
Right.
So some Christians may be heartened and inspired by your words, and yet still unclear on what resistance really means, especially in response to this another biblical passage here. This is also from Matthew. This is in Matthew 5. You have heard, you know this well, Bishop, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, you turn the other one to him as well. So how do we interpret what you've just said in light of our Lord's words here?
Well, take the eye for an eye. So that's violence is done to me, I do violence back. And he's saying that's not what I'm recommending. Don't resist in the worldly way. Don't resist in the customary way. But look at this, very interesting, that passage about the turning of the cheek. In Jesus' time, the left hand would have been considered unclean. You never use it for any kind of social interaction. So if you strike someone on the right cheek, that means you're striking them like this, with the back of your right hand. That was the gesture toward an inferior, toward a slave or someone you considered inferior. So what's Jesus saying? Someone strikes you on the right cheek, what do? Stand your ground and give them the other cheek. In other words, what are you saying? I refuse to cooperate with the world you're living in. I refuse to live on these terms. I'm not going to punch you or strike you back, but I'm not running away. I'm standing my ground, and by turning the other cheek, I'm mirroring back to you your own unjust aggression toward me. Now, once you see that, now look at the method of Gandhi, look at the method of King, look at the method of John Paul II. It's exactly what they were doing. An example I like to use with John Paul is this is way back at the height of the fearful period when there was, I remember it, very real fear that the Russian troops are going to invade Poland and all that. John Paul goes to Poland, and General Jaruzelski, maybe older folks will remember him. He was a Polish general who was running the government at the time, and he wore these dark glasses, kind of a sinister-looking figure. And he welcomed John Paul at the airport when he arrived, and he had his speech in his hand, and it was shaking as he read it to John Paul. He was so nervous, and John Paul politely listened. And then they say he took his own speech, and he went like this. He held it out to Jaruzelski like, I'm not afraid of you.
Wow.
His speech wasn't. And then he calmly read his speech. Well, then watch what he did in Poland. It was exactly this sort of King Gandhi approach. Site after site, even though they were trying to block him, they were trying to dissuade people. There was false information, but the people came out in huge numbers. And he talked about God, and he talked about human rights, and he talked about human dignity, and he talked about the danger of tyranny, and he just on and on and on. I heard about this actually from some of the folks who were there. He's in Krakow, right? His great archiepiscopal residence in Krakow. And he's leaning out the window and of the residence, and there's a huge crowd out there. And he's speaking these provocative things that were clearly anti-communist. They were clearly, and the Vatican officials were inside behind him going, doesn't he know what he's doing? Can someone stop him? Because he wasn't playing the diplomatic game.
Right.
Well, he knew exactly what he was doing. And by God, it worked. He so stirred the Polish people non-violently. Not a shot was fired, but so stirred the Polish people, and the Solidarity movement emerged out of that, which then kind of swept its way across the Soviet bloc and eventually into the Soviet Union itself. And the evil empire, I remember when Ronald Reagan called it the evil empire, it fell with barely a shot being fired. So don't tell me that this kind of resistance doesn't have real social effectiveness. I've seen it in my own lifetime. So that's how Christians resist.
Sounds like one of the key elements here is a very public display of courage.
Yeah.
We're not afraid of you. Are you seeing any hope on the horizon that there are sort of resistance taking that form?
What I am seeing, I don't know. What I am seeing is a revival of interest in religion. That they tried, go back now 25 years roughly, when the new atheists emerged, and there was just this I think it was like a knockout punch. Let's just give a knockout punch to religion. It didn't work. It didn't work. In fact, now I think in the popular culture, you see a lot of signs of deep interest in religion. So live it publicly. Say it. If someone's attacking the church, call it out. Now we have means. God knows the social media's got a shadow side, but we've got means now to publish something, put something on X. With this Paris Olympic thing, people ask me. I said, write to the Olympic Committee, write to the French embassy, make your voice heard. Say we're not happy about this. There are how many Christians around the world? Like 2 billion or something. Well, we've got a very powerful voice if we learn how to use it, and we shouldn't acquiesce to these attempts to marginalize us.
So still at the within Scripture, Matthew ends this chapter of the Gospel with our Lord declaring, "You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes his sun rise on the bad and the good and causes rain to fall on the just and unjust." So Bishop, in light of this passage, how can we interpret resistance as being an act of love for the enemy?
No, and that's exactly what it is. See, because the way we're describing it here, it was simply eye for eye for tooth. That's just like crude justice, you might say. Or if it's, look, I'm offended, so I'm going to get you back out of my anger and I hate you. See, that accomplishes nothing. Gandhi's famous line, an eye for an eye, yes, making the whole world blind. What we're describing is precisely an act of love. Love means to will the good of the other. And so what are you doing as you resist in this provocatively nonviolent way? You're trying to draw the aggressive person back into community. You're trying to help them see what they're doing so as to move them to conversion. John Paul II didn't hate General Jaruzelski. He was trying to draw him back. King, it's his great virtue. King didn't hate the people who were persecuting black people in the South. He was trying to love them back into community. So that's perfectly consistent with Jesus' sermon.
We look out on the landscape, and perhaps many of our audience have actually experienced this kind of prejudice, this kind of bigotry in direct or indirect ways, and it can generate anger. It can generate a very deep sense of anger. What should we do with that anger? Should we see anger as a problem, or is anger a sin, or is it something that can be channeled to a productive end?
It's valuable in the measure that it's righteous. So righteous or justified anger is something like outrage at injustice and a desire to do something about it. So, that's manifested in a lot of the great saints. Aquinas would say the deadly sin of anger is a kind of irrational overreaction. I think he puts it's an irrational desire for justice. So I've been hurt, but now I'm going to destroy you.
Yeah.
Since you hurt me, I'm going to double hurt you. Well, that's anger is a deadly sin. But we can, I think, look, John Paul, Gandhi, King were angry in the positive way. They were angry at injustice. John Paul, looking at what the communists had done to his people, of course he was angry. But then there's a positive, call it use of that anger, for good ends.
So you've already brought up the late Cardinal George several times in today's conversation. And another one of his great observations, he says the church is expansive enough to include both pacifists, that is, those who will not resort to physical violence under any circumstances, and those who believe physical force is morally justified in cases of individual and communal self-defense. So how, Bishop, can we coherently combine these two moral impulses into one coherent faith?
Yeah, and it's an important distinction to make there. So let's say, for example, this Paris Olympic, outrage. Terrible. It was a terrible thing. And I, in my own little way, fought back in what I think was an appropriate way. If I had organized some kind of violent attack on the Paris Olympics and called in an airstrike or something, well, that's obviously ridiculous. So we take a few more steps, though, to, let's say, a nation state being invaded unjustly. Or think of, put it in a smaller context of a father of a family and his kids are being attacked physically. He's not going to stage a nonviolent social protest at that point. He's going to take action. So the church has always recognized that in those extreme cases, yes, you can and should defend your family, defend your country. That's why Cardinal George said, look, I'm glad not everyone's a pacifist because I want there to be an army to defend the country. I want there to be a police force to defend the city, et cetera. But what's interesting to me about his observation there is, having said that, it's also good that there are some people in the church who are pacifists, meaning those who are living even now as we will all live at the end of time, and we will all live in the eschaton when perfect peace obtains. And he compared pacifists to celibates, which I thought was very interesting. He said, in the same way, I'm glad there are celibates.
Yeah.
But I'm glad not everyone's a celibate. We wouldn't get very far as a human race. But that there are people like me and like him who've taken a promise of celibacy are witnesses even now of how we will all love in the eschaton. So pacifists witness even now. And I think that's, to my mind, the best way to deal with that issue. Celibacy, what a terrible denial. No. It's an eschatological sign. How can there be any pacifists? Are they crazy? No, they're an eschatological sign. But I'm really glad the vast majority of people aren't celibate or pacifists. And I think that's a fair way to
yeah, it's a very fruitful and powerful analogy.
Yeah, I've always found it that way.
So, Bishop, as we move towards a conclusion, it was, as you know, the early church theologian Tertullian who said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So the question is how should the church's long history of martyrs, those who gave and are giving now their life for the faith, inform us on what it means to defend the church from anti-Christian bigotry?
Yeah, and I mean, Tertullian was right, and it's been proven right over the centuries. I said that when I was filming in Namugongo, the site of the martyrdom of Charles Lwanga and his companions, and this massive crowd descends upon that site every year. And the scene was, I looked at the camera and said, Tertullian said that the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christians. Is that true? And I said, you tell me. And then the camera panned back, and there's this ocean of people. Yeah, that's always been true. And the martyrs, are resisting nonviolently. But see, by God, they're resisting. That's important to see. There's a kind of imperialism in the martyrs, but it's not a worldly imperialism, but it's a resistance to evil, and their own death becomes the sign of the struggle, and it mirrors back to the aggressive or unjust person their aggression. So that's always been true. That's the extreme case of it. That's the extreme example of what we've been talking about.
And finally, Bishop, on the surface, it may seem like the call to resist anti-Christian forces in the culture and the call to evangelize the culture are two different tasks with two different, perhaps even opposing goals. So how do we unite them coherently?
Yeah, no, to see the latter as a form of the former, that is a way of evangelizing. So maybe go back to the Olympic thing, that little video that was kind of a cri de coeur on my part. It was just this, I was angry. But that little video, I think, did have evangelical power, that it went out to so many people and it summoned Christians to a deeper, I hope, sense of their identity. Maybe even reminded people, I guess there are some of these Christians still around. So I think that has very powerful evangelical import. And again, it's under the rubric of love always. We're loving the culture. Again, Cardinal George, you can't evangelize a culture you don't love. So we're loving the culture, and we don't want to condemn it. We want to draw it back into a healthy stance.
Well, Bishop, it's now time for our listener question. Today we have Kira from Denver asking about how she can share her faith in a family that does not practice any religion at all.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Kira. I'm from Denver, and I'm currently a catechumen. My question is, how do I share my journey with my family and friends? When I receive the sacraments this spring, I will be not only the only Catholic, but the only practicing Christian in my life. Most of my family and friends are against religion. I'll be grateful for your advice.
Yeah, it's a good question and a complicated one. But, I would say, here's my first instinct, is invite a lot of your family and friends to the Easter Vigil when you're received fully into the church. And have them come, and it's kind of a long ceremony, but have them come to it, and then maybe elicit their questions about the ceremony, what things meant. Maybe you could explain a few of the finer points of the liturgy. Use the liturgy itself as a route of access, as a way of maybe opening a window or a door into the mystery of the church. But blessings on your journey.
Well, thank you, Kira, for reaching out to us. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Bishop, we've come to the end of another show. A fantastic conversation as always. Thank you.
Always a joy for me, Matt. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.